You are listening to In Artversation, a discussion program as part of Warin Lab Contemporary Podcast, a podcast that explores art and sustainability. I am Sukontip Nakasem and I'm your host. Contemporary art mirrors contemporary culture and society. The artist conceives the work in context of the society they are living in. The work of contemporary artists is a dynamic combination of materials, concepts, and subjects that challenge the traditional boundaries. We could find that the presentations of contemporary art are diverse. Contemporary art is distinguished from other art movements by the fact that it is not conceived under any uniform principle or ideology. Audience play an active role or even completes the artwork by offering their personal reflections, opinions, and interpretations. In this episode of In Artversation, we'll look at a specific angle of how contemporary art shapes culture and society and vice versa. I speak to two brilliant curators and researchers in Southeast Asian contemporary art, Loredana Pazzini-Paracciani and Zoe Butt. Both of them are writer and curator based in Thailand. Loredana, what is your view of the relationship between art and society?
The relationship between art and society, I think it's a very close relation. And I think for this series, for this particular podcast, we might want to speak specifically for contemporary art. The relation between contemporary art and society is very connected. It's a two-way process. One cannot exist without the other. In general, even since the beginning of art, for instance, we know that cavemen used some form of art to record and represent objects around them. From there, through the century, art has become a sort of a very distinctive reflection of society as well as a tool for social change. And in that, contemporary art is the most politically and socially committed of the arts, I believe. If we look very briefly at modern art, or at least the end of the 20th century modern art, we know that art has been defined by various major art movements that indeed would express themselves as a result of the times in which society was living and facing different challenges. For instance, in response to the horror of the First World War, Dada artists and Dada movement proposed an art that was very light, almost nonsensical, just to deal with what the war has left, the scar that has left on society. In the mid-50s, pop art challenged the fundamental tradition of fine art by including imagery from popular and mass culture, such as advertising and comic books and mundane mass-produced objects, precisely to be closer to society. Later, towards the end, in the 60s, 70s, a major event happened in the world, such as, for instance, the Vietnam War, which really shocked the world at its core, prompted the coming up of different art movements that were dealing with the situation, with the critical situation that society was living in. Fluxus, for instance, that promoted a revolutionary way to live art, an anti-art, or the art that was represented by the artists themselves. So all this movement, and these are only the briefest mention, have increasingly close the gap between art and society in the sense of bringing art and society closer together. And finally, we come to contemporary art. As I said, in my opinion, the most politically and socially committed type of art, the art of today, produced in the second half of 20th century and the early 21st century, takes oftentimes the form of protest, addressing political and social issues which have a direct impact on our society. Contemporary artists are globally influenced and are culturally diverse and produce art from different mediums within different frameworks to challenge the boundaries of social culture. Contemporary art is part of our society. It concerns issues that are very close to us, such as identity, family, nationality, community, sense of community. So it really pervades every aspect of society, from providing new perspectives, raising important questions in relation to the time we live in. And I think the most important is probably offering an alternative ways of the production of knowledge in today's culture.
We are living in a fast-paced society with social media spreading ideas and movement in a matter of days or hours. How do you think that has affected the relationship between art and society?
Well, I think it's aided a lot of artists in promoting who they are, what they're doing, where they're doing it. It's made for incredible amount of exposure and knowledge to be exchanged rather instantaneously. So it means that audiences of art, producers of art are connected to social cause and social developments at a speed unlike we've ever experienced before. This means that artists are in one of the most rarest moments of history to be able to respond to the climb of our time with pretty much immediate course to action. And this you can see reflected in numerous social movements across the world, such as the Arab Spring, the Occupy movements in Hong Kong, even, dare I say, the process of protests you're seeing in Thailand. So what we're seeing is the benefit of social media in connecting all forms of consciousness to the realities of our times. But I think on another level, on a flip side, what this immediacy has done is present the realm of art to the general public as something to be digested in a matter of seconds. You can see numerous museum and art gallery globally over the COVID period producing programs specifically for social media and the space of the internet, which to some who don't know much about art might start to collapse artistic practice as something that can be produced in a matter of seconds, sold in a matter of seconds, and witnessed accordingly, which I don't think has very productive or constructive space to think about how culture, to me, is actually a space where we are allowed to slow down. You know, you enter a museum, you stand in front of a painting or a sound piece or a film, and you're actually expected to, well, you're not expected, but I think if you're going to really enjoy it, you're going to give time. So I think it's a bit of a double sword. On one hand, there's a positive side, and on the other, a rather questionable one.
I think it can backfire to us because, yes, it's very rapid, the dissemination of ideas, and therefore I think the reaction is also just as rapid. So on the one hand, this is great because the hashtags movements such as Me Too or Black Lives Matter in certain days, on particular circumstances, they reach out such a huge public, such a huge audience. And of course, artists have capitalized on that, creating and producing work that were very meaningful in relation to these issues. But we need to be aware because they can be counterproductive and they can even be dangerous. That's, I think, a risk that we have to face with technology. And while technology is great on the one hand, it might be very challenging and quite dangerous on the other.
Art people like you and I have a notion that art is a powerful communication tool to transform people's ideas and the way we can view certain issues. Can you give some example for our listeners of, what kind of art that has done that?
In my previous answer, and also the way I look at contemporary art, I really emphasize the activist component of contemporary art and the hands-on approach that contemporary art takes to society. But we have seen this through history, different ways in which art has been used as a communication tool. You mentioned which might have been the most obvious or outstanding ways. I think there are negative and positive examples to make. Propaganda art is one way that art has been used as a very powerful tool of communication to promote a specific political viewpoint or ideology, appealing to a certain emotion or sentiments in order to help a political leader or a specific political view. So war propaganda is one way art has been used as a way to incite, a communal response. And there have been many, many cases in history, from the very successful and perhaps most horrific Nazi propaganda to recent wars and recent different type of how art is used as a tool for political and ideological perspective. But on the flip side, artists also articulate the trauma or the relation to society through their art. For instance, I mentioned earlier the Vietnam War. and the way this has had an impact on art. I've been based in Southeast Asia. I worked on different projects on Vietnam and specifically on the legacy of the war. And for instance, in 2019, I worked with the Vietnamese American artist Dinh Q Le precisely on a project on the Vietnam War. And as a Vietnamese refugee and diaspora artist, Dinh moved to the US very early in his life in the 90s. And since then, he has been preoccupied with the representation of his homeland, Vietnam, and of his devastating war. So I'd like to mention one example of works that he developed, taking the idea precisely of propaganda art, which is the use of the poster, but flipping it in the way the poster was used to convey a wider message. So this was a work that he made when he was in school, still in university, and he created various posters, which he then placed in the campus, which were featuring images relating the American and Vietnamese casualties. So it was opening up the approach to the war, not only from an American perspective, being in America, but also as a Vietnamese, through his Vietnamese eyes living on American soil. And I mentioned that Dinh is a diaspora artist, and I think diaspora art, even if it's not a movement as such, but it's more a form of expression, is another important way that art has been used as a tool for communication, especially now and especially during and after the pandemic, which has really made us reflect on the notion of nationality and movement, crossing borders. We cannot not mention another important way in which art has been pivotal in creating awareness, which is in the sense of art for the environment and sustainability. More and more museums are addressing these issues through their projects. And I think it's very important to depart from art to bridge the gap that divide more developed countries and less developed countries, so the global north and the global south, on placing us on equal footing in addressing issues of environmental sustainability.
Can you give example of art projects that you feel have made an impact on society?
One of them is taking place in the Congo by an artist called Renzo Martens, who decided to commission a well-known architect to build a white cube on what was once a plantation in the Congo. And Renzo Martens then worked with a series of local Congolese artists to produce work that was then sculpture work that was then sold in very privileged white cubes in Europe. Renzo was talking about the history of colonization in the Congo, talking about how art and its structures have been enabled by the profits of colonialism. Indeed, many museums in Europe were only built because of the profits of colonialism. So this is a project to me that has presence in the local, that is trying to, from the sale of art, give back to a community that has suffered under colonialism and raise some critical questions about how colonialism exists still today. Then there are other projects where we see artists raising issues about contemporary politics in Southeast Asia. Recently, I had the pleasure of working with Rongsak Anuwatlimon from Thailand and Marianto from Indonesia, both of whom raised issues, firstly, on the plight of the lower Mekong, secondly, the massive sand erosion and corruption at the base of Mount Merapi in Yogyakarta. Both of them developed individual artworks that spoke about local response to the damage, the environmental damage occurring as a consequence, and that these communities relied and depended upon many local spiritual myths as a form of navigating and sustaining this particular geography. So these are vastly different kinds of projects, one that's very internationally questionable and globalized, the other very local and regionally responsive. There are many others that could be mentioned, so that would be a book.
I've seen the exhibition in Mai Iem that you identified. What about the project that you see that it brings the change? It brings social change in some form.
I personally do not consider art responsible for bringing about social change. I don't see art as responsible for prompting or creating the ground. Social change and art is a means to which consciousness of an issue is raised. It is an incredibly important vehicle through which narratives of negligence, destruction, disenfranchisement are recalled, made evident. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that because of these art projects, social change occurred. Social change occurs only because a nexus of human production comes together to work together. Policy change, environmental concerns, economic drivers, they all have to work in concert, to which art is one of those engines. I believe artworks and artists can create or prompt change on an individual basis. And on that front, indeed, I can say of myself that there have been many artworks that I have witnessed and have come out learning a piece of history where I have endeavoured to seek to support, for example, Amar Kanwar's Lightning Testimonies, which is actually currently on view at the Metropolitan in New York. It's a piece that talks about the immense amount of violence women endured during the partition of India, and that these are stories that are not written into state official archives. And this piece sought to document and give presence to these stories of women. And after I saw this piece, I vowed to support the cause of victims that I come to in my midst somehow, that I can't stand apart and just observe anymore, that where I can, this cause is something that I want to pay more attention to. So on those kinds of notes, I definitely believe art has an impact. But similarly, I have seen how artists, in concert with other forms of human thinking, Tania Beguera from Cuba with her Immigrant International Project has raised the concern about a myriad issues to do with immigrants, forced migrations, incarcerations, and that her working with numerous main art establishments to policy change to social welfare has raised awareness through her initiatives. But it's always done in concert, in collaboration with other forms of human production.
Talking about things that we could see today, there's a lot of biennale, a lot of gallery showing artworks, and there's a lot of presentation out there that people can see. So what impact do you think these presentations have had on our culture?
This question is huge because the history of the exhibitionary model of art globally has been going since the advent of religious patronage for painting. This idea of the exposition, the salon, which today has migrated into the idea of the international biennial, triennial, the festivals. These have been going for as long as human memory. So the impact of what these kinds of presentations in a contemporary landscape in Southeast Asia, what they're offering is not easy to answer because it's not uniform. Across Southeast Asia, we have a vastly differing set of cultures, societies, and accessibilities to contemporary art. If you live in Vietnam, there are no museums who are collecting contemporary art in comparison to, say, here in Thailand, where there are numerous private collections and state collections looking at the content. So the impact is not uniform, for one. The presentations of this form that are occurring globally with inclusion of Southeast Asian arts has done tremendous things for exposing and demonstrating how, say, for example, Thai art is perceived on a global platform. So it's opening up perceptions about what is it to be a Thai contemporary artist today from a global to a local perspective. So in that way, these exhibitions that take place, be they as festival or biennale or museum show, offer opportunities for different definitions to be at play. And in terms of its impact on our culture, I would hope that people perceive contemporary art as something that offers a critical space of reflection on what our cultures are, and that artists inside their artworks, which take place as presentations in these platforms, very unusual and unique spaces which we are allowed to think on things that perhaps were not permitted inside our educational or domestic or religious spheres. So in short form answer to your question, I would say that they are incredibly important to offering differing reflections of differing realities, but in the region, it cannot be ever considered uniform.
I think these presentations, which either are clearly art platforms or not necessarily so clearly art platforms, are very important in shaping our culture. For instance, I've been thinking of environmental events that not necessarily start from the viewpoint of art, but end up involving artists and shaping the mentality of our society. You probably remember the 26th UN climate change conference that happened last year in Glasgow. And of course, it was a major political event. So they were bringing together political figures in deciding and discussing environmental issues. But artists were invited as well. So this is an interesting example of where politics and art try to work together for the benefit of the issue that we're dealing with, the environment. And so artists, even some of them were quite skeptical, but anyway, responded to the platform, taking the opportunity to build support for action against climate change. And this, I think, has affected greatly the community, the media community, but also has had ripple effects in the larger community. Another important platform, I think, that we should mention is the Sydney Biennale, this current Sydney Biennale, which is titled Rivus, which in Latin means river, and which precisely looks at different ecosystems of wetlands and freshwater ecosystems, precisely from the perspective of art and politics. And the amount of artists that this Biennale has brought and an artistic intervention within the community, within those ecosystems, has triggered a great response from the larger, broader community. So I think these are all very substantial platforms. In terms of other issues, for instance, of gender equality or how we look at art, this current Venice Biennale is quite radical in a way because, first of all, has never been directed by a woman. So having a woman as a director, Cecilia Alemania has already shifted this male-female ratio. This is a great example of how a proper art platform is shaping awareness on notion of gender equality, and also how to look at history, art history in particular.
On the flip side, how does society shape contemporary art?
I think if we go back to the first point, what is the relation between art and society? I think that there is mutual inference between the two. So art shapes society and society is shaped by art. The two feeds one of the other. So it's difficult to say what comes first, but for sure, we've seen even through some of the examples that I've given, I think that the actions taken by society in terms of the environment or gender divide are substantial. In terms of human rights, for instance, there have been in the last decade or even longer, very important social movements. Let's think of all the hashtag movements that have had such a deep effect on society and have inspired so many artists. Of course, the Me Too movement, which is a social movement against sexual abuse, harassment and rape culture, has triggered so many female artists in particular to develop in new works and open up a new possibility for art to communicate and really support society in becoming aware of these issues. Black Lives Matter is, of course, another huge movement, political and social movement that seeks to highlight racism, discrimination, and inequality experienced by Black people. And this also has affected hugely how we look and think of our society. And then as a consequence, this effect on society is reflected also on what museums and galleries or art platforms do. For instance, in the curatorial approach that museums or other art platforms take, in the way museums collect artworks and present their narratives, in the way museums, I speak about museum because the most representative guardians of contemporary culture, but this can be extended nowadays also to galleries and wider platforms. But in the way the discourse opens up to minorities by including or focusing on gender, ethnicities, and so on. And all these actions foster great conversation. And this is, I think, eventually the aim that contemporary art has, that is to create conversation, to open up possibility for conversation and to really reach out to the people. So this conversation may happen in a museum because, as I said, it's the guardian of contemporary art, but actually they could happen just as well in train stations or in hospital or in any place that is meaningful, to engage with the people, to communicate and to present art in a meaningful and productive way to create a response from society.
In my mind, contemporary means practice that reflects the times in which we live. So if you classify yourself as a contemporary artist, your work is looking at the world around you and choosing to talk about it in some way. And a good contemporary artist will be thinking very critically about that, as in they'll be offering some kind of perspective or opinion that raises certain questions. Doesn't have to answer, but raises certain questions about what that reality is. So the impact of our reality, our societies, on contemporary art is crucial. Indeed, there would be no contemporary art were it not for a society. Collectivized individuals working together in community is largely how this idea of an art with a capital A exists. It cannot exist separated from society.
On this topic of contemporary art shaping society, do you think what can we see coming from the art world in the future?
The art world is not uniform. What happens in the Western and American spheres is very different to what we'll find happening downstairs. What we see as a relationship between society and art is something that is compelled by politics. And there are differing complexities of our political attitudes globally. In the West, the visual arts is heavily paid for by billionaires and millionaires with their various institutions. And we see differing political structures and social attitudes being fought within it, as we've seen with Me Too. But in contexts like Southeast Asia, Africa, or the Middle East, art is a heavily contested realm to which many authoritarian regimes refuse artists to work and show. So what we expect to see coming out of the art world in the future is incredibly complex. And as has historically been demonstrated, that relationship is a fraught space, but it's always a space of heavy visual wonder in showing how we resist. In my mind, it's about what kind of ideas are we moving towards or resisting. And that's a historically evident relationship.
Art also go in tandem with society. So, say in Southeast Asia, do you see any trend?
I really don't believe in generalizing. The region is so incredibly diverse. In places like the Philippines, with its new government coming in, we can expect to see some changes, or we would want to hope to see some changes occurring with a release of Duterte's violence. Or in Cambodia, who are soon to face a new election, and undoubtedly it won't present the ousting of Hun Sen. And so what's going to unravel there could be potentially very violent, to which its contemporary artists will likely choose to respond. Or here in Thailand, we've got a forever rotation of tension between the red and the yellow shirts amongst our landscape of private investment in the arts. Who's just to know to what extent we see these institutions and these political frames at all in relationship to each other. Or we have in Vietnam, where COVID really had heavy impact on certain organizational structures for the arts. And so we see a shift occurring where a lot of production is actually now migrating north to Hanoi, as opposed to where it has been in Saigon in the past 10 years. So, it's vastly different, would be my answer.
Thank you for listening. Please stay tuned for our next episode.